Welcome to the SOB radio show, where we have fun, interesting guests, and hot topics. Each week, we offer insights into music, fashion, health, fitness, and humor. Do you have the perfect guest for us to interview? I want to know. Drop me a line on our Facebook page at Spunky Old Broad 1 or reach out to me on our website at spunkyoldbroad.com. And now, back to the show. Hi, everyone. We have a delightful show for you today. I had the pleasure of meeting this woman at a media summit, and I think she's just fascinating, and she has done so many wonderful things and has a very interesting story to tell. So let me read you her bio because I think it's very, very interesting. Her name is Dinah Lin, Lin, and she's an international business executive who did it backwards. She inspires audiences with her personal stories and life lessons that it's never too late. Now 78, she has lived her message several times during her life, beginning her career at 36 after being a full-time mom for 15 years, getting her MBA from Columbia Business School at 40, climbing the corporate ladder, and finally breaking the glass ceiling to become vice president at a Fortune 500, before moving to Beijing at 58 to study Chinese and reconnect with her roots. A year turned into a decade as she experienced firsthand the unprecedented transformation of China. But that's only part of the story, folks. She and her family escaped on the last boat out of Shanghai in 1949. She grew up in a small town in Ohio where they were the only Asian family. Early marriage and motherhood dashed her dreams of becoming a diplomat, working to improve relations between the U.S. and China, and she has always felt a deep sense of gratitude for being both Chinese and American. And prior to moving to China, she was that international executive and entrepreneur with 2 decades of experience ranging from high-tech startups to Fortune 500 companies. And she served as a senior official in Washington, D.C. from 1989 to 1992. And she has a memoir. It's called Daring to Dream Once Again. It's never too late. And it reached number 4 on Amazon in Women in Business. So this is the woman you're about to hear, and she is just so interesting. Welcome, Dinah.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you so much, Gayle. You know, I'm listening to that and I go, wow, I did a lot. But I've lived a lot of years. So I guess,
well, you know, it's interesting. I remember, folks, I told you that I had met her, and she's 78. And most of you know I'm 82. So we're kind of in that same classification. But Dinah does not look 78. I can tell you that. If you met her walking down the street, you probably say she was 55, 60, something like that. She's absolutely stunning. And of course, we know now all of the things that you've done. And yes, you did do it backwards. So that is very apropos. But you say that you're entering the 6th stage of your life. And of course, I always say I've reinvented myself 7 times. So you've got one more to go to catch up, Dinah. But
okay.
Tell us about the stages, the other stages.
Well, you know, Gayle, this hit me when I was writing my memoir. Actually, a lot of things hit me when I was writing my memoir. And I realized, you know, that from 1 to 20, it was my, you know, of course, my carefree single years, you know, living a life of a teenager, whatever. And then at 20, I got married. I was still in school, in college, and my first child was born after my junior year, which made for a very interesting senior year. So for the next 18 years, from 20 to 38, I was married and living the life of a wife and mother and living in Southeast Asia in 5 countries over a period of 15 years. Then from 38 to 58, those were my, you know, MBA, climbing the corporate ladder, my corporate career, those years. Then at 58, I decided to follow a dream and move to Beijing to study Chinese and reconnect with my roots. And then I meant to stay probably a year or 2, and I fell in love with the country, the culture, the language. So I stayed a decade. And then I came back yeah, I was 68. And so in January, when I turned 78, I go, okay, all right, now it's time for me to start yet another new stage of my life. So that's how I broke it down.
Well, you made a couple of statements that I want to ask you about. You said that you were married for those 18 years or 20 years or 15 years, whatever it was, and that you were in China too, but you were raised in Ohio. So how did you get back to China during your married years?
No, see, what happened was that after we were married for a couple of years, I finished my college. My then husband, was transferred. He always wanted to work overseas because actually
Okay. So you
he was.
followed him.
Oh no, those 18 years I followed him.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You
Yes,
followed him.
absolutely. Yes. And I was a full time, my daughter was born in Malaysia. So I had two children and I was a full time mom, social hostess. He was climbing the corporate ladder. Yes, that's what happened.
Wow. So then you came back, and this is very important for those who are listening. Saying, "Well, it's too late for me," and "Golly, I turned 50, and what's my life all about now?" You always hear me talking about how it's never too late and how it's always important to be studying and learning and trying and doing. And Dinah is a perfect example of this. I mean, and very stylish. You need to, if you ever saw her. She is absolutely impeccable in terms of style. She is absolutely a beautiful, beautiful woman. So you need to understand that all of this is possible with your own will and your own set of circumstances and your own ability to say, yes, it's not too late and I can do it and I am going to do it. Whatever that choice is, we're not telling you what choice to make, but it's just never too late. So, you know, you had your first job at 36. And was that in the US or was that outside of the country?
That was in Hong Kong.
It
You
was in
know,
Hong Kong.
it was in Hong Kong. We were living in Hong Kong. We lived in 5 countries, and the last country was Hong Kong. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, I just can't continue doing this, fundraising for charities, lunch with the ladies, the whole social life that we had, which was very good. But I thought I just can't continue to do this anymore. And playing tennis, it was a wonderful life. But I thought I just have to. It was always my intention, actually, originally, was to graduate from college, work for a few years, go back to school, get a graduate degree, MBA or something. Yes, and so it was not easy to convince my then husband.
You keep saying then husband, so I assume
then
that
husband. Yes.
you either were divorced or widowed.
No, divorce, yeah.
Divorced.
Divorce.
So,
We grew apart. That's what happened.
well, the other thing that I'm very interested in with everything that you hear, in the news over the years, that you stayed in China for 10 years because of it being a communist country and you didn't feel suppressed or anything like that. You didn't feel like you were being curbed, especially as a woman.
Well, when you say especially as a woman, actually the women in China were quote unquote liberated when the communists took over. For better and for worse, they were liberated. They were sent to work in the factories. Of course, there were nurseries to take care of children. But women stopped taking I'm not sure they ever did, but they kept their own maiden name. The women in China are very, I was going to say assertive. They're very strong. And
wow.
And
well, that's something I'm sure many of our listeners didn't know. So that's a wonderful point for you to make.
Yes, I mean maybe in prior generations they were not, but certainly when I was there, which was the year 2000 to 2010, and I did not feel surprised. I myself was surprised as how free, openly. And I mean, not as much then as now. But I remember the taxi drivers would openly criticize, aspects of the government and be critical. And I remember feeling a little bit surprised that they felt they could talk like that.
Very interesting, very interesting. And of course, especially in Hong Kong, especially what they're going through now with all of the demonstrations and so forth and so on. It's really interesting. I mean, I happened to go to Hong Kong to speak and was fascinated by. And the funniest thing was when I went down to the lobby of the hotel I was staying at, which was the Shangri-La.
Okay.
My neighbor from down the street was in the lobby. He was there attending a seminar.
Oh,
And I
for
thought to
goodness sake.
myself, wow, you
Oh
could
my
never have an
gosh.
affair, even in Hong Kong, this far away from home,
Okay.
because you always
Oh,
run into somebody
you
that you
you run
met
into
or knew,
some.
And I just thought that was so funny because who expected my neighbor down the street to be in the same hotel I was in Hong Kong? But Hong Kong, I assume, is going through a lot of trauma now, and I'm sure you're watching that with great interest.
Well, actually, tell you the truth, I haven't.
So let's talk
Hong
about
Kong. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, let's go
you
ahead.
believing in It's Never Too Late and why, when you turned 78, you said, oh, it's time to go into phase number 6. What was the trigger? What was it that happened?
Well, I'm not sure there was any one trigger. It was just that I came out with my book. It became a bestseller, and that was.
You mentioned that you were in Hong Kong, and I was in Hong Kong, as I said, to do a speech, and I am wondering how you feel about what's going on there right now.
Well, actually, I haven't given it that much thought, and I know that for a while they were showing all the last summer they were showing on TV all the videos of the demonstrations, and it's a very complex issue actually because it's never what it just seems. There are other issues involved. The people there, I think, were demonstrating as well against the standard of living. The Hong Kong government has not done the greatest job in terms of providing jobs and living accommodations, and it's a very crowded place. So
it is
there were
crowded. I know when I was there, I couldn't believe how crowded it was.
right,
But
and
everybody seemed to be, at least when I was there, which was not recently, was very, I mean, they seemed happy and everybody was getting along and unemployment was low. I mean, everybody seemed to be working. So I guess
well,
things
but
have
Gail,
changed.
I'm sorry. When was this? When were you in Hong Kong?
I was there in probably the late 90s, early 2000.
Okay. Okay. So the situation economically for the people there was better, but over the years, as more and more trade went directly with and through China and not going through Hong Kong as much, it affected their economic situation as well.
Now I get it.
And
Well, I
I
don't know
also,
if we were cut off before I talked about the neighbor down the street. Did that come across? Did you hear that?
I heard you.
Okay, well then
Yes.
I'm sure the audience did too. And I just thought that was so funny because I have been to so many, I worked in 50 countries and everywhere I went, I either found people who I knew or people who knew somebody I knew. It was quite interesting to me. So it just shows how global we become.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
so anyway, you started this at uh, I think your last attempt was when you turned what 78 or just before that?
Well, actually, let me just, uh, I'm not sure whether you got this. Those 10 years that I lived, 2000 to 2010, I was in Beijing, not Hong Kong.
Right, right. That I know. You
Okay.
said, yeah.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to make sure that
But
we,
Beijing is even a more central location in terms of China and how things are over there.
well,
So, but you found it quite nice, or you wouldn't have stayed.
actually, I found it more than nice. I found it exciting and invigorating. It was just, especially that 10-year period, China underwent an incredible, massive transformation. I mean, when I got there, well, I was there in the late 90s. I was there in the mid 90s on business. I used to travel international business, but people just went from no telephones seemingly overnight to cell phones. I mean, they just completely skipped over this landline. They were having to wait 2 or 3 years for a landline, and forget that. And then they went from bicycles, hordes and hordes of bicycles and very few cars, to seemingly, again, overnight, traffic congestion. Everyone had cars. The change, I don't think it's possible to really adequately describe it. It was just phenomenal. And then, of course, 2008 was the Beijing Olympics. And so the whole city was like a construction site. It was just, once I walked outside of where I was living, and I counted 17 of these high, those cranes they use for building.
Right. Sounds like Miami.
Okay. Okay. So it was a very exciting time for me to be there. And the early years I spent, studying Chinese and focusing on my Chinese. And then I started doing consulting, international business and marketing for companies. And I was active in the American Chamber of Commerce. So I had a very full, very interesting life. And it was very international. A lot of foreigners there doing business that decade.
And what made you come back to the States?
Well, it just, the congestion, the traffic, the smog was getting worse. And
sounds like Miami again.
All right, there you go. And, and I had 2 grandchildren. Now I have 3, but at that time I had 2. And I met a man. Now, I told my son it was not because of the man, but my son always thought it was because of this man. So after a decade, I just felt like time to come home. I mean, America, US is home. And it just, I had a wonderful decade and it just felt like it was time. So
And were your kids all in the States? Were your kids were your children all in the States?
Yes, my son and my daughter, I have 2 children, and they're both in California, which is why I'm here, of course. My parents, of course, had passed away years before. So it was natural. I never lived in California before. I'd always been an East Coast and New York kind of girl. I lived in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in Connecticut, and New York City. Yes, and even Florida. I was outside of Miami for one of the positions I held. But anyway, I came back to California.
Well, this brings me to another question, and that is, you've lived all over the place. You've lived all over the world, and you've lived all over the United States. And there are people who can't get themselves out of their own home. So how did you handle all these moves, especially with kids too, and all the changes, which some of them were your husband's because your then husband, because of his situation, and some of it was because of your career. So how did you feel about moving all these times, going to new cities, making new friends? Because there are people listening to this who can't even imagine doing that. So how did you feel about all of that?
Well, I think sometimes we forget because it was so long ago, and I always, I move forward. So I forget what happened in the past, which made it a challenge when I was writing my memoir. But I think in the beginning, when I was young with 2 little kids and making the moves, it was not that easy. But I soon realized, and sometimes it would take me, like forever to unpack and get settled and kind of start to make friends. And I realized early on, we were only going to be there a year or 2. It seemed like that. And if I took forever to get settled, I was never going to be able to, enjoy a life. So I got pretty good at just getting to a new place, getting settled, reaching out, making friends. And I think it really goes back to a life skill that I have, which is adaptability. And I feel
that's what I was just going to say, Dinah. You have to be adaptable. You have to be resilient.
Yes.
You have to be willing to take these chances. And there are just some people who just don't do that. And I'm going to ask you something that people always ask me, and I know my answer, but I want to know your answer. Where do you think all of this resiliency and adaptability and desire to learn and continue to accomplish and all of those things, where do you think that came from?
I do think, and I don't know, I can't give percentages. I think part of it came from my parents. I know that my mom had incredible courage and determination and perseverance. And I saw how much she had to change and adapt, moving from, escaping China, where she had this, very privileged life, really, in many ways, coming here to the US and all the changes that she needed to adapt to. And she did so willingly and happily because she loved being here and she was so grateful to be here. So she was a wonderful example for me. And I think part of it is innate. Somehow I feel like I've always had this. I remember always saying, I love change and challenge. I love change and challenge. So that's
Well,
part of
and,
it as
and so
well.
when your mom came, did she come here alone or she was with your dad? Or how was that happening?
Well, my dad was here on a 1 year research grant at Ohio State University, and he was sponsored by our church. And he was supposed to go back, but my mom wrote to him and said, "No, stay." She said, "I'm going to find a way to get the children and myself out." And when I, think back, I just don't know how she ever thought she could do that because everyone wanted to get out. Shanghai was in chaos. It was just really amazing that she was able to get the tickets and get us out. So,
That's so interesting because when anybody says to me, who has been the biggest influence on your life or who is your biggest mentor, I always say my mom. And it wasn't because, I mean, she didn't never even finished high school, my mom, but she was one of the smartest women I ever met. But she was just, it was the way my sister and I were raised. And my sister's very successful. And even though she's a psychotherapist and she's retired now, although she does still have some people who won't stop coming to her. Uh,
uh,
but she's very active in the community and she's very active in various organizations and has gotten like, I don't know how many lifetime achievement awards. And I too, I have gotten, I think, 5 lifetime achievement awards. It's just the way we were raised. And I didn't always like it because I remember I had to go out with the first boy that asked me, not the second, because that was not the way you did it. And she
oh,
made me get on the telephone when I was 8 years old to phone in my father's pharmacy orders. He was a pharmacist, and I had to phone in his drug orders. And not only could I not pronounce them, but I couldn't even read his handwriting, which was as bad as a doctor's.
mm,
So, I mean, it just shows you how much influence we
absolutely
have and from our parents. And
right.
the other part of it too is, you mentioned your grandchildren. You know how many grandparents are raising their grandchildren now. They're not, I think I can't even remember what the statistic is, whether it was 4 million or 5 million kids that are being raised by grandparents, not their own parents. So,
Mm,
there's just so much influence that can go around like that. And so that's very interesting. So now
yes.
you're living in California, and how do you feel about that?
A transplanted East Coast girl to California. No, I feel blessed because California is a beautiful state and you can't ask for better weather. And of course, I was in Northern California. When I first came back from Beijing, I was in the Bay Area because that's where my daughter, my 2 older grandchildren are. I say are because my oldest is a freshman in college. Of course, she's home now, as we know, all the kids are. And then I moved down to Southern California 3 years ago because my granddaughter down here is now 6. How do I feel about California? I love it, except for the politics, but we won't get into that. um,
Well, it's funny because I have homes in California too. I've had a home in San Diego since 2002. So I used to go back and forth all the time every month, but now I am in Florida since I came
mhm.
back and I'm not flying and I don't think I'll fly the rest of the year because I want to make sure everything is safe and we don't really know what's going to be happening in the next many months. But this has just been fascinating. We're going to take a break in just a minute or so, but um, this has been fascinating, Dinah. I think everybody who's listening needs to say, look in the mirror and say, and I don't want you to get depressed over this because I know many of you are staying home right now, but I
Yeah.
want you to be able to look in the mirror and say, am I happy with who I am, where I am, what I'm doing, and what else would I like to put into my life to make it whole and complete. And I think that's really, really important. So hang on, folks. We're going to be back with Dinah Lin in just a few minutes.
Hi, this is Dr. Gayle, and I wanted you to know I have a whole bunch of other things to offer you. If you go to spunkyoldbroad.com, you will see an array of SOB stuff for sale and all our latest products and additions. If you're interested in getting on TV, I have a brand new course, Get on TV. And if you want to start your own business, you'll want my SOB Guide to Business Success. I know you'll love them all. I guarantee it.